Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Paul Syverson from the Naval Research Center. Paul, are you with us already?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi.
So I wanted to do a quick show of hands with the participants, and I'm hoping that I'm not stealing any of Paul's thunder. Please raise your hand if you ever used Tor. Okay. Oh, I see also panelists. Yeah, that's a good. And then the second question, so please lower your hands. And the second question is, how many of you are aware that Tor was actually started by the US Navy, which is supported by the US government? Okay. So it is a great pleasure to have Paul joining us today, discussing Tor. And as I mentioned before, he's with the US Navy, the research branch, I hope. And
right.
The amazing.
I'm curious. I didn't see the hands. How many in each case?
So about slightly less than 20 were using it, and about all of them knew that it came. Well, it was funded originally mostly by the US government, and now I hope that we will hear more about why you should use Tor.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. I've got slides, and this should all work. Yes. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to say something about Tor and about onion routing, of which Tor is an instance, and also say a little bit about self-authentication. I am employed at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., although I'm not at NRL. I'm in my now grown and moved away one of my kids' childhood bedroom, hence the posters. I'm not going to get into a lot of the really deep technical details. I'll touch on some, but I'm primarily primarily hoping to give you a basic view of things, and also I hope an understanding of what the actual properties are of these things, because there's a lot of confusion and misinformation out there. So how do I get the, I keep losing my mouse for some reason here. How do I get the slides to advance? They're not. I'm trying to. Okay, well, more technical fun problems. Okay, I guess I'll just do it this way, which is not what I intended, but we adapt. So some of the main takeaways that I hope you will have by the time we're done is that Tor and Onion services are primarily just ways to access ordinary internet sites more securely. So they're not some arcane, mystical thing. And it might be helpful to recognize that they are now about where web encryption was back around 2001. If you had an encrypted website that you set up back then, there was a general question about what on earth you were doing. You must be doing something criminal. And why on earth, nobody needs to, why would you encrypt a web page? But now, of course, large sectors of the economy completely depend on this. Amazon literally would not exist without it. And a lot of that was because it was providing protections that at the time people didn't realize they were going to need. Lastly, I'm going to be focused on trying to not make my screen disappear and my what I'm saying, but if there are any really pressing questions, I hope my moderators will jump in and let me know. So there are no stupid questions. There's a few places where I will have pause period to specifically, but if there's something that confuses you, please don't hesitate to jump up and I'll try to answer them. So let me start out with a classic motivational use case that was one of the kinds of things we had in mind when we came up with onion routing. So let's assume we have Navy Commander Alice. She's actually in the Navy. I'm a civilian employee of the Navy, but she's an actual naval commander, and she's going on travel overseas. And before you travel overseas, you're required to get anti-terrorism training from the Department of Defense. And so here's a typical slide from one of these trainings, and it tells you to be anonymous and blend in and don't walk around with a Pentagon baseball cap on, because somebody might see you and drag you off in an alley and do you harm. And you know, it's good advice. So let's assume that she follows this advice, and now she's I'm getting all kinds of messages here. Something. Oh, somebody asks, when I say that there's where web encryption was 10 or 20 years ago, do I think that in 10 or 20 years, all web browsing will be over Onion? I would say that it's very hard to predict the future, but if that happens, everybody will be more secure. And all right, I'm gonna plow ahead here. Here she is. She's followed this advice, and now she's back in her hotel room, but she needs to connect back to where she works. Let's assume she works where I do at the Naval Research Laboratory. And the question is, how can she do so securely? And what does she need? Well, you might say, well, she needs to be encrypted, but that's not enough. If she's encrypted, then somebody can still see, oh, there's a connection to NRL, the Navy, and then they right away, that makes her interesting. Oh, this person's from the Navy. What local companies are she connecting to? Why is the Navy interested in these companies? Oh, she's traveling to this city next. Why is the Navy interested there? So, that's a problem. And perhaps even worse, if we think back to the advice that she shouldn't be walking around with a American flag T-shirt on and stuff in a potentially dangerous city. Well, if somebody's going to attack her based on that, they have to just be standing on the right corner to notice her, and then either act right then and there, or possibly, formulate a plan. Whereas somebody who works for the hotel and has access to all the, check-in records and whatnot, or more likely somebody who contracts internet services to half the hotels in town, can just look and say, oh, she's in room 416. She's going to check out on Thursday. And so they can just sit centrally and gather a lot of information that is dangerous. So that's one kind of use case that we might have to think about. There's lots of others. You might be engaged in open source intelligence gathering. I don't mean anything arcane like, oh, you're actually from an intelligence agency or anything. Perhaps you're just a patent examiner and you don't want a company to know that one of their rivals is interested in a particular kind of technology and thinking about patenting it. I've talked to people in law enforcement who say we try to investigate gangs in our area and we get locked out. They notice that it's law enforcement and we have trouble doing our investigations. So I help them to figure out how to use Tor. You may have citizens with whom you're trying to communicate, and either they want to know about, maybe personal sensitive information about health, or maybe they want to do some whistleblowing, or they are interested in amnesty for certain kinds of crimes, but until they find out if it actually even is a crime and whatnot, they might not want to be telegraphing who they are. And so there's lots of different applications for this. This last one I'll come back to later, I think. So what would a solution look like for all these different things? Well, I think we have solutions that kind of work across the board, but let's stick with Commander Alice as just a motivational example that will carry through for the other things. Now you might say, oh, put her behind a VPN. And the problem there is, well, if it's a Navy or even a US government VPN, well, you might hide that she's connecting specifically to the Naval Research Laboratory, but the fact that it's a Navy VPN reveals the thing you were trying to hide. And so you need something that's going to carry traffic for a wide variety of people with diverse interests and diverse adversaries and diverse goals. And so the solution is, well, first of all, it's got to be bidirectional and low latency, so you can use it for, web and chat and things that, practical things that people would like to do. But as I said, it can't just be carrying traffic for the US Navy, and it has to carry traffic for a diverse user population. But a diverse user population is not going to trust necessarily a US government system, so it has to have diverse management. It has to have diversely managed infrastructure so that different people with different trust values will still be willing to use it. And you also can't just, write it and say, oh, we're from the Navy, we wrote this great code, just use it, it's fine, because they don't know that. So you have to be open source, but that's not enough. It has to be well documented. You have to encourage people to pound on it and publicize their results so people have a really good idea of what it is they're getting from that. And our first publication release for our code for onion routing was 1996. So that was been fundamental from the beginning. So the basic idea that we had is a network of diversely managed relays so that no single one can betray Alice. Somebody could see her entering the network, but doesn't know where she's going, and somebody might see a connection going out to a server at NRL, but doesn't know where it came from. And it's important to note that this is generally referred to as anonymous communication. You'll hear, I believe, quite a bit more about anonymous communication from Claudia Diaz on Thursday, I think it is. But she's going to be talking about mixes. Onion routing is not mixes, and unless it comes up in the Q&A, I'm not going to talk more about that right now. But the main point is, it's fine as a technical term, but the word anonymity carries a lot of baggage, and it's important to recognize that our goal here is not so much anonymity per se as to separate identification from routing. So if you think back to Commander Alice, well, when she logs into her workstation at NRL, she sure as heck doesn't want them to let anybody in there. She wants to be not only identified, but authenticated. She wants to make sure that the only person being allowed into those accounts is her. And similarly, they want to make sure that only authorized personnel are getting in. But that doesn't mean that she wants to be revealing that information to everybody who is along the communication path from where she is to where she's trying to communicate. So it's about separating the identification from the routing. The way we do that, in a nutshell, this is a very high-level description of onion routing. So Alice's computer knows about the onion routing network. I'm going to skip over how that happens, but she basically has a list of all the relays that are out there in the network, and she picks one at random, and she establishes a key with it. She uses Diffie-Hellman, if you know what that is, and sets up a key, and then she tunnels through that encryption and sets up a key with the second relay that she also chose at random. The first relay did not decide that for her, and also doesn't have access to this yellow key that she shares between just her and relay 2, and then through to the third relay, and then once that circuit is built, then she can send through a message that says, I want to talk to Bob. And as far as Bob is concerned, he just got an ordinary TCP connection from the location of relay 5. He doesn't have to know anything about how Tor or onion routing. It's just going to work. And then data can go back through in the same way it arrived, where the keys are then applied in reverse order, and then she can strip them all off. Now, a lot of times when people talk about this, they focus on the confidentiality of the metadata of who's talking to whom. But it's not just about confidentiality, it's also about authentication. Alice built this circuit and she used the public keys of each of these relays. So she knew exactly where she's going. Here's a screenshot of connecting to DuckDuckGo through a Tor circuit, and it has gone through relays that are at each of these IP addresses that are shown there on the screen. And because it uses the public keys, not only does it go through these relays, but she knows it's going through these relays. Ordinarily, when you use the internet, you have no idea where your bits are going on the way to and from someplace. But here, the user actually knows that. So you have a lot more information about where your traffic is traveling. So that's a very quick nutshell description of onion routing. And you might say, well, okay, onion routing, what's Tor? Well, the name originally came from the onion routing, because after we invented it, there were a bunch of imitators, and this was, the onion routing. So it was a class of onion routing design that we started working on almost 20 years ago. And then as it moved on from being basic research, which is what I'm funded for, then a US 501c3 nonprofit organization was formed around 2006. And yeah, so that's the Tor Project Incorporated. Sometimes I explain my relationship there in a nutshell by saying that I'm not from the Tor Project, but the Tor Project is from me. So sometimes we use Tor to refer to the software on your computer or your phone that connects to the network and builds those circuits we were just talking about. Sometimes we use it to refer to the network itself. There's currently about 7,000 nodes in the network, most of them relays. There are also these things called bridges, and they serve about 200 gigabits per second of application data for millions of users every day. If you go to this metrics.torproject.org, you can see graphs and numbers and things for all kinds of stuff like that. Sometimes we use Tor to refer to the group of people that work on this, not just for Tor Project Incorporated, but researchers at all kinds of different places, and people who do trainings. And sometimes we just refer to the whole thing amorphously as all of that. Now you may be asking yourself, wait a minute, I thought this was a privacy week here, and you seem to be talking about security a lot. Is this a security or a privacy technology? Well, the answer is, from the perspective of protecting users and systems, it doesn't matter. It's really all the same thing. It's just how you're using it. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of the blind man and the elephant, but this is basically what's kind of going on with Tor. So if you're a journalist, oh, this is anonymous communication. And if you're an abuse victim trying to escape a bad domestic situation, it could be a lifeline to safety. If you're trying to look up about disease online and you don't want your employer to know, maybe it's privacy. If you're the government, it's traffic analysis resistant communication. But these are all the same thing. Now, there are criminals who use the system, we know this, but they actually have lots of other ways. In fact, they have, in some sense, better ways, because all the Tor relays are publicly listed in directories that anybody can get to. Botnets generally are not. So, if you get rid of the Tor network, the honest people who are trying to protect themselves are the ones who lose out, and the criminals will continue along just fine. So that's why I say we need Tor. So that's my first segment. I've just taken you through basic background and motivation and concepts and design. If there's any questions, quick questions at this point, I could try to answer those before I jump into the next thing. I don't know how to handle that. Or even to see if anybody's there. So I don't see anything on chat. I don't know how to see the chat. I'm going to, hello?
I'm just mentioning there are two questions in the chat. The first one, can you comment on the legality of using Tor and why do you use the leading zero in the years? I think this was
comment on the legality and what was the other question?
Why do you use zero in the years?
Oh, okay, so I'll answer the second one first, is because I agree with the folks at the Long Now Foundation that it's important to take a long view of the world, and I don't worry so much about the Y2K or Y3K problem as the Y10K problem. And I think that thinking about things in terms of how they're going to affect the world in the long run is important. So that's that one. Legality, I mean, I don't know how to phrase this, most of the civilized world, as far as I know, it's entirely legal to use Tor. I'm not a legal expert, and it would be hard for me to comment. There may be places in the world where it's actually illegal, but most of the democratic countries, I guess I'd say, it is legal, and in those places where it isn't, I don't know what to say. That's unfortunate. It's a good thing, and it shouldn't be illegal. It's legal in the United States. I believe it's legal in Israel, but you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. And it's legal throughout most of the world. So I'm going to move on to the next segment of things now. So I've given you a little bit of a description of onion routing and Tor, but I haven't said anything about how safe you are, and that's kind of what I was going to get into next. So if you recall from above, Alice, if somebody sees her connecting, they don't know where she's connecting to, and on the destination end, they can see somebody who is talking out of the network but don't know where it came from. But what happens if somebody is on both ends of the connection? Well, in onion routing, we lose. Basically, if an adversary can just sit there and watch the pattern of bits coming in at one end and then see the same pattern at the other end, see the timing between the packets as they go by, and see how many packets go by in one direction and then back in the other direction, it's pretty easy, and this has been well documented and confirmed. You can tell who's talking to whom. And even if you do things like padding and other things that have been tried, it's very easy for the adversary on, say, the Alice end to just put in their own timing signature, just delay a few packets, just a reasonable amount, so that it's not going to affect performance necessarily, but it will be detectable at the other end. So this is very hard to prevent, and onion routing doesn't try to prevent it. What it tries to do is just have a big enough network that it's very hard for the adversary to be in the position to do that. Sometimes I call this the Mr. Miyagi Defense, after the old Karate Kid movie, where the mentor used to say, best way to avoid the punch is not to be there. So the idea is try to make it hard for the adversary to be where you are. And because of that, the security ends up being approximately C squared over N squared. So if the probability is C that a given onion router, C over N, that a given onion router is compromised, that it's at both ends, C squared over N squared. Now, that's a bit of an oversimplification for Tor, because we choose relays based on the node capacity. So somebody who's sitting on a very fat pipe can handle a lot more traffic, and that way you can do better load balancing. Similarly, not all the relays are allowed to exit the network. I mean, they have chosen to allow themselves to exit the network to destinations. It's roughly about 1/6 of them, carrying about 1/4 of the total volume. Also, on the other side, the entry guards, there's only about half of those relays. So it's not exactly C²/N². It's quite a bit more complicated. And there's a lot to that I am noting and then going to ignore for the rest of the talk, because I already have too much slides. So given that, how do we define security? Well, there's there's a couple of different ways you can go about it. Initially, you could just have a possibilistic definition of security, where if somebody knows that Alice 1 is using the network, but there's also Alice 2 who is using the network, and either one of them might be the person who's communicating with Bob, then you could say that Alice 1 has anonymity because it might be somebody else. And we actually characterized this for onion routing in IO Automata some time ago. But maybe the adversary has been watching for a while and has seen, they know from just general observations that Alice 1 uses the network a lot more. Most of the connections in the network are from Alice 1. And then if there's a connection where, well, maybe it's from Alice 1 or maybe it's from Alice 2, but the adversary might have good reason to think that with high probability it's Alice 1. And then we've also added that to our formalizations. Now, one problem is the way that we initially characterize these things didn't mean anything to cryptologists, because they have their own standard way of characterizing security, and people would say, I don't understand what guarantees I'm getting here. I mean, is this semantically secure or what? So we actually were able to give something of an answer for that back in 020, 012. We characterized it in the universally composable framework. I'm not going to get into the details. This is a picture of the ideal functionality that simply either revealed source and destination to the adversary or didn't. That's a pretty simple ideal functionality. There was follow-on work by others who made it a little bit more realistic by capturing the actual sending of messages and the building of circuits and things like that. And then they further developed things in what they call the ANOA framework. So there was quite a bit of progress made in that direction. So, okay, great. So we were able to define and characterize security to some extent. Are we missing anything in the models developed so far? And big surprise, yes. Quite early on in Tor, Feimster and Dingledine noted that, look, the adversaries don't just live at the relays. If they're sitting on the links between Alice and her entrance to the network, and between Bob and his exit from the network, well, they can do the same thing that the relays could. And this is because onion routers are computers that live on the network, but they're just run by individuals or companies, but they still route around the internet the same as anything else. They go through autonomous systems and Cisco routers and things like that. And if the adversary is living on one of these, then they'll be able to see communication between relays or to or from relays. And so the first definition of security that Feimster and Dingledine looked at was what they called path independence, security for links. And the idea was, well, if the adversary, so they were looking at what are called autonomous systems. These are the fundamental units by which interdomain routing happens on the internet. And they said, well, is it ever the case that the same single autonomous system lies on both ends of the connection? Then they're going to be able to see Alice talking to Bob. And they didn't actually empirically look at this. We did that a few years later, and there's been a whole bunch of follow-on work on this. but the initial first thing was basically this notion of path independence, that is just any one entity that could be at both ends of the connection. So that gives you the idea that it's not just relays, it's all kinds of different things that come into play. So some of the kinds of resources an adversary might have are relays. They might just own bandwidth through which they might choose to try to set up relays. They might own some of these autonomous systems. As I said, there are these things called internet exchange points that glue many autonomous systems together as an efficiency mechanism. There might be undersea cables. I guarantee that right now, this talk is going over at least one undersea cable across the Atlantic, probably to somewhere in Europe, and then I wouldn't be surprised if it then goes through at least another one across the Mediterranean. So you can try to map out all these undersea cables, and we have had a characterization of that. It could be that you try to avoid routing through a particular country because you think, oh, I don't trust them. But if there's a mutual legal assistance treaty, an MLAT, between a country that you do route through and one that you are worried about, well, now you may not have the protection you think you do. So there's all these different resource types, and then you can ask, well, how much of the resources do they have? Maybe they own the destination host and they're trying to figure out sources. Maybe they own a certain fraction of the overall Tor bandwidth. Maybe they're Equinix. Equinix is this massive internet exchange company. They own lots of internet exchange points. I believe the last I looked, which was a long time ago now, but over 90% of all internet traffic typically goes through an internet, an Equinix IXP. So if they're your adversary, you could be in a lot of trouble. And then we can also say, what is the adversary trying to do? They might be trying to just compromise as much traffic as possible, just hoover up as much as they can, but they might also just be looking at a particular user, or they might be trying to figure out which users use Tor. So there's lots of different things they might be trying to do. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but we have built an attempt to work out all these dependencies and take the probabilities that an adversary compromises each of these different sorts of things and build that into a model to say how likely it is that a particular adversary is compromising a given Tor relay or a given virtual link. So we've got all these different characterizations of all these different things. We've got links and nodes and is there anything else missing? And yes, there is. We haven't yet talked about time. All of the above definitions and metrics give results for essentially all the traffic in the network. So they talk about things like the average anonymity or the worst case anonymity for all the traffic. And they're based on either a single snapshot in time or a collection of all the traffic over time, so that you can say things like, well, we look at all the connections through the network and we know that 4% of them are compromised by this adversary. But if you're using the network, you don't know what to do with that information. 4%, what am I supposed to do with that? What you'd like to know is, I'm going to use the system in this way, and I'm going to be using it for this long, and I want to know how safe I am or how not safe I am. So if I am Alice 1 and I'm making a lot of connections through the network, and what I'd like to know is how long can I keep using the network in the way that I like to use it until I end up in a situation where I'm compromised. So we actually started to look at this in a paper that we had 7 or 8 years ago now, where first of all, we created a model of various normal user behavior types. We didn't actually do user studies, but we did sort of a priori models ourselves for research purposes of somebody that engaged in a mix of web and email traffic, somebody else who did a lot of chat on IRC, somebody else who did a lot of BitTorrent, and a couple other things. And we said, okay, so these are sort of normal user behaviors. Then we also created a model of the relays in the Tor network and the underlying internet, the ASs and the IXPs that I already talked about. And then we looked at metrics that took time into account. So one I've already alluded to, for one of these behaviors, how long does it take until a circuit gets compromised? Or if you engage in that kind of behavior, what fraction of your connections get compromised during a given period? So there's tons of results in the paper, and we looked at, things like, well, if an adversary has to distribute itself, what's optimal for the fraction of entry guards and exit relays that they should have, and things like that. I'm not going to go into all of it, but here's just one of the graphs from the paper. And what this is basically showing is different size of adversaries with respect to the fraction of network bandwidth they own. And perhaps unsurprisingly, essentially, the larger the fraction, as you get more and more megabits per second that they own, then the time to the first compromise gets shorter. So here's some of the main results from that paper. First of all, we noted that for all the types of users we looked at, typically 80% of them could expect that for a moderate Tor relay adversary, by which we meant we looked at some of the largest operators of Tor networks at the time, and we characterized that as something an adversary could actually do. They would get de-anonymized in about 6 months. So on the one hand, they get de-anonymized, on the other hand, it takes 6 months. BitTorrent users were by far the worst off with respect to the fraction of connections compromised. So not only is it somewhat antisocial to do BitTorrent over Tor because you're eating a lot of bandwidth, but also you're likely to get de-anonymized, so maybe Tor is not helping you as much as you would think. We also looked at the path independence thing that I talked about a little while ago, but we didn't just look at it arbitrarily, but for, say, particular ASs. And there were some, I think they were in Germany, but I'd have to look back, where roughly 100% of the users were going to be de-anonymized for their traffic normally within about 3 months, slightly smaller for IXPs. And then lastly, path independence says, suppose your adversary owns one AS, but there's no reason that they couldn't own multiple ASs. A lot of times there are companies that do, and adding a second AS greatly reduces the median time to first client de-anonymization from taking over 3 months to just typically over about a day. So this is the overview I've had of the metrics and security that Tor provides. And again, I'm happy to try to answer a few questions if there are any right now. Otherwise, I move on and be happy to talk about Onion services. And again, I don't know how to see the chat on this directly.
There are no questions in the chat or in the Q&A, so if you want to give...
Oh, wait, here it is. Q&A, no open questions, answered, dismissed.
And the chat is... So if you want to give people a few seconds...
Well, oh wait, here's chat.
Here's a question.
I'm sorry?
So there is a question in the Q&A. Those times by Michael, those times are for a single long-term connection or for decryption of the public keys?
Oh, those are not, no, those are not single long-term connections. That's if you're using the network normally. So I didn't cover this, but the way Tor works typically is if you're doing web connection or something, well, of course, it keeps the circuit open as long as that web connection is open. It also uses an isolation, so it goes by domains, so it won't do different domains over the same connection. But a circuit that has no new connections for about 10 minutes will be closed, and this is typical. So it is true that if you are on, say, IRC, you might keep a circuit open for a long time, but those results were for what you could think of as, you know, ordinary, normal web browsing. So,
Thank you.
okay. Well, I'm gonna move on to talk about onion services. So far, we've been very much focused on the client end of things, and we're still, to some extent, focused on protecting the clients, definitely, the users, but we were talking about a Tor where the destinations don't know anything about Tor. As far as they can see, they're just getting TCP connections from the internet. And we designed onion routing that way so that applications didn't have to know anything about Tor to be accessed by it. But if you do set things up so that your destination knows about Tor, then you can provide additional security. And I'm going to get into that right now. So let me give you another motivational example. So here we are with Commander Alice again, and she's overseas travel again, and this time she's lost and she's late for a meeting, and she's there in her, you know, government issue pink convertible with a laptop computer. Okay, so that's not realistic, but it was the only picture I could find that had both a car and a computing device. More likely it's a normal looking car with a phone, but anyway, there she is. And she wants to figure out where she needs to go. So she's going to look up her route via Google Maps. Now, the way this ordinarily would happen is she puts Google Maps into her phone, and it returns an IP address from a DNS server, a domain name server, and then it tells her this is the IP address to go find and talk to Google Maps, and that's how she gets her information. But one thing that can happen is the server can be malicious, or there can be hijacks on the system. And then instead of being directed to Google Maps, she's directed to the Central Bank of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. So that's okay. We've got crypto. Crypto solves everything, right? So there are these things called certificate authorities that her browser will knows about and trusts. And they will sign a certificate that says, only if you see this yellow key can you be sure you're talking to Google Maps. Well, there's two problems there. One is it's all well and good that Google has this certificate, but it has no way to give it to Commander Alice because the only address she has for Google is this incorrect one. So there's that problem. But even worse, there can be a rogue CA or a deceived CA who issues a certificate that says, oh, if you see this green key, that's the one for talking to Google Maps. And then not only will she think that she's talking to Google Maps when she's talking to the Central Bank of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, but she thinks it's guaranteed. It's been shown to her cryptographically. And you might say, well, wait a minute, that sounds kind of weird. How plausible is that really? Well, we don't have to answer hypotheticals because that actually happened. That happened not to Commander Alice, presumably, but back in 2012, there was a hijack that sent all of Google effectively to this bank. So this is a real thing that has happened. Now, onion addresses don't have this problem because they're self-authenticating. So the address that you go to encodes effectively the public key that is going to correspond to the private key that only the site owner would have. So this gives the site owner, first of all, more control over address lookup. I'll come to that in a minute, but also more control over their own identity and authentication. nobody can hijack and issue a bogus certificate for them. So in order to get into a little bit more how onion services work, let's recall ordinary vanilla Tor. So here in this picture, the idea is that this cloud is all the Tor relays, and these dotted lines are one of those 3-hop, 3-relay connections. So the first relay would live right where Alice connects to the network, and the last relay would be where it goes out to some server, and then the other relay somewhere in there. And this is how most Tor traffic, in fact, is used. We know from our metrics that it's only a small fraction. It's been growing a bit, but it's still only around like 5% of total traffic is going to onion services. Almost all of it is just going out to ordinary internet destinations. So how do these onion services work? Well, if somebody wants to set up an onion service, they create a connection into the Tor network to what's called an introduction point, and they're just going to listen and wait for people to connect to that. And then the users know about the introduction point. I'll come back to how in a moment. And they connect to it where the server is listening and say, I would like to talk to you, and I'll be waiting for you at this rendezvous point if you're willing to talk to me. So assuming that the server does want to talk, then they build the circuit. Recall that each one of these dotted lines is one of those 3-hop onion service Tor connections. And so now the server has connected to the rendezvous point, and they can drop the introduction circuit, and then communication will happen over this circuit where the rendezvous point doesn't have any association. Unlike the introduction point, it's not at all associated with the particular server. It's just some random point out there, and it doesn't know anything about the users or the destinations. So this is basically how onion services work. And as I said, that gives the site owner control over authentication, because the site address is self-authenticating, and it also allows you to effectively reach a server even though you don't expose the server's location in the network. Now, I said that the client knows about these introduction points. How does that happen? Well, if somebody wants to set up an onion service, they publish information about their onion service in a directory system that's actually a distributed hash table that's comprised of, I think it's a few thousand of the Tor relays. It's not quite, I think it's not quite half the network, something like that. But assuming you meet certain minimal stability requirements for your Tor relay, then you will be automatically assigned to be part of this. And then the onion address itself will guide the client software to know where to go to fetch directory information, and then they will learn about things like the introduction points. And to put this stuff into the network at all, you have to have the private key corresponding to the onion address. So again, this is giving the site owner control over its own lookup information. Now, one of the things that was happening, however, in the earlier days of onion services was that people were setting up relays because they were just curious to figure out who was connecting to particular onion services, or excuse me, not who, but how much people were, say, accessing particular onion services, whether the onion service wanted to make that information public or not. So they would position themselves in the DHT. They could kind of predict based on the onion address where to set up their relay as to be in a position to be the directory server for that information. and then they could just watch how much people were accessing it. So two things were changed about 3 or 4 years ago. One was that you could no longer predict where you were in the circle. The Tor directory authorities would collectively create some randomness that would only be accessed from about an hour before, and that would go into the part of determining where things go. It wasn't just the onion address. It also used this randomness. The other thing is that what's stored was stored effectively encrypted under a hash of the onion address. So if you know the onion address, then you can just go and look it up, and that's easy enough to do. But if you have a directory because you happen to be in the right place in the DHT, if you don't know the onion address, then you don't know what it is you're storing there. So that was one improvement that was made a few years ago. Another one was that we sort of updated the crypto. So old onion keys were getting on the weak side. They were based on 1024-bit RSA and SHA-1 hashes. And the new stuff is based on ED25519 curves, which are assumed to be secure for a long time, we hope. And the onion address itself, it's actually no longer a hash. It's actually just a direct encoding of the public key together with a checksum and some other stuff. So another last thing I'll say about the new design developments, as we noted, the way onion services work is you have a 3-hop circuit from the users, and you have a 3-hop circuit from the servers that are mated up together, and that allows the server to be reachable without exposing its network location. But if you're not so concerned about that as a server, and you just want to be providing better authentication to people and better performance and some other things, then you can just connect directly effectively to a rendezvous point, and you save a bit of overhead. And that has also is now widely deployed. So as I said, onion addresses are self-authenticating, and they're quite useful. And in fact, in 2015, they were made an officially reserved top-level domain internet standard by the IETF, who's the body that essentially writes the standards for the protocols that run the internet. And you might be saying, wait a minute, I'm a little confused. This is an official standard, and I've heard about onion services. I thought this, isn't it, where is the big evil deep dark web that I keep hearing about? And I'll go into this a little bit, but basically a lot of that is about selling magazines and writing, good television. It's sort of related to the same reason that in hacker movies, the hackers always have ergonomic keyboards. It's not because they all have bad wrists. It's because that's cool, high tech looking. And so if you talk about the dark web, it sounds very mysterious and tech and cool. And you can say things like, oh, we set up a company to go find out if your credit cards are missing on the dark web, and we'll let you know. But actually, it's not quite like that at all. And this is what I call the iceberg of ignorance. You can find pictures like this all over the place. Here's another one. You can just go and do an image search, and you'll find tons of them. And they're all just completely misrepresenting the situation, I can tell you. And that's because I would say the dark web is to a large extent an illusion. That doesn't mean there's nothing in reality going on here. What it means is that sometimes you look at something and it appears to be something, and there it is in front of you. You can look at it, but then as you move along, you can discover that what you thought you were looking at is a real thing, but it's not quite the way you were seeing it before. So I don't know if you know about the tri-bar illusion, but somebody built a sculpture of this somewhere in Australia, I think. So why do I say this is an illusion for the dark web? Well, this is the dark web as popularly depicted. There are these onion services out there, and there's all these criminals using them, and you can't really get to it easily. It's not indexed, and you need special arcane equipment, and that's where all this evil things happen on this dark web, when in reality it's much more like this. Most online criminal activity happens on the open, popular, big web because, amongst other things, criminals need to be able to access things and to do their criminal enterprises. And most of what's unindexed is neither what the criminal activity is going on, nor is it onion services. It's just databases and internal services in companies and things like that. So all these things are there. It's just that the overlap between them is tiny. And even this picture isn't very accurate because onion services compared to the other things is tiny. There's a few thousand onion services reachable at any given point, whereas there's unfortunately lots of online criminal activity out there. And it is true that the unindexed web is quite huge. So coming back to the iceberg of ignorance, I want to unpack some of the myths about onion services that come out of this. So one is that onion space is way bigger than the regular web. The onion space is the deep web. And as I said, there's maybe a few thousand onion addresses directly reachable at any given time versus millions on the less secure web that's only protected by TLS and things like that. The next myth is that, oh, this is Tor and onion services, kind of the same thing, right? As I said, we know from measurement that most Tor activity is not actually connecting to onion sites at all. It's going to servers the same as everything that people are used to going to. So in that sense, I think the iceberg of ignorance is perhaps best considered upside down, because onion services compared to the rest of the web is actually very tiny. Next, what's wrong with this picture question we can ask is this thing about, the onion services, that's this unindexed thing. But in fact, onion space is indexed. There's a search engine called Amia that specifically returns onion addresses for things that you might type in. But even ordinary search engines do index onion space, just not very much and not yet. So here you can see something from DuckDuckGo. Here's this a result from Google, and they both do have onion services in there. The main reason, it's not because of some arcane technical weirdness, they don't know how to do it. It's because there isn't that much of it, and it's not that interesting and useful to do this. As this space grows and more people are using it, and it's more popular and it gets more links, well, you're going to get more results returned. So the next mistaken impression is that onion services are a subset of the deep web. So so the usual picture is that, oh, up on the surface web, we have, Facebook and Google and Twitter and things like that. And then way down in the darky deeps, we have, onion services and Tor. But what's the largest source of pages in onion space? Well, it's Facebook. All of Facebook is available as an onion service. So it's not actually unusual for somebody to set up the exact same server, and they're just accessible more securely as an onion service or less securely via the ordinary web protocols. And but it's the same server. And so all of Facebook is available. In fact, all of Cloudflare, they have onion services. So if you access a site via Tor that's hosted by Cloudflare, there's a good chance that you're actually being redirected through what are called the alt services to one of their onion services, and you don't even know that it's happening. So there isn't that much distinction between onion space and the regular web in terms of what's accessible. And relatedly, well, if it's mostly for criminal activity, well, then so is Facebook and Cloudflare. I mean, that's the big stuff out there. And in fact, if you're worried about criminal activity, in Italy a few years back, it was mandated legally that if you want to report corruption on the web, then you had to use an onion service in order to be able to do the reporting. That was in order to protect the people that might be connecting in, and also to protect the server against people who might be quite interested in what's on that server. Last thing I'll mention about this is that I've mostly been talking about the web, but onion sites aren't just for the web. Something that people have been using for these for years is administering systems behind restrictive firewalls. If you have a system you have to administer, but the only way to get to it is that it only allows outbound connections, well, you can set up an onion service, and then you can still get to the system securely. If you're, say, forced to work from home because of COVID, you can still get a secure connection to that system. And then another thing is secure file transfer. One of the hardest things to do a lot of times is just get a file from one computer to another one actually securely. So there's this thing called the onion share, where if you want to transfer a file somewhere securely, you can just, it will just automatically create an onion service, and then and you have that address, and then you can, say, send a signal message or something to somebody that you want to transfer the file to, and say, files you're interested in at this address. They go, they retrieve the files, and the onion service just disappears, and you've securely transferred the file. Lastly, we all, well, not me, I don't trust these things, but lots of people have, smart fridges that tell them if they need milk when they're at work, or they have security cams in their home and whatnot. Smart thermostat, I don't, but, and the problem is all this stuff is not very secure. This is well documented. But if you set up your smart home interface behind an onion service, then it's much harder for somebody to find it, and it's also more secure just trying to access it. And people have actually set this up and made it available. So in sum, onion services, no, they're not part of the dark web illusion. It's not where most of the crime happens on the internet. It's not a subset of the deep web. It's not part of the deep web, in fact, at all. It's already indexed and ranked some, and it will become more so as these things become more popular. And what it does do is provide site owners with some control over address lookup by doing something more secure than DNS, and giving site owners control over authentication by having addresses which are not subject to TLS hijack. And as I just said, they're not just for websites. So I've got one more section to go, but I'll be happy to answer questions about onion services. And we'll leave it on that.
So actually, Paul, we have two questions. One of them is relatively early.
Yes.
So to make sure I got it straight, a government seeding a number of relays around the network can easily de-anonymize and get hold of a lot of the identities destinations.
Sorry, say again. Government doing what?
So Roy's worried about somebody, a government or agency seeding a number of relays around the network can easily de-anonymize and get hold of a lot of the identities and destinations. So you do traffic analysis by putting many relays, entry nodes and exit nodes, and trying to correlate them. Is it possible?
Well, so that's not so much specifically about onion services, but I mean, this goes back, I guess, to the previous section, but that's okay. I usually take weeks to come up with a question, so that's fine. So yes, it's a concern that a large adversary is might be able to, the more of the network an adversary owns, the worse things could be. I would say that if you're worried about governments, hard to know. I mean, it's not like I don't work in this space, but I would think that their ability to access internet exchange points and the routing infrastructure and look at things going in and out. There have been papers that have researched the extent to which you can do BGP hijack to look at things going in and out of Tor. So I'm not saying that somebody might not do that, might not set up some relays to try to de-anonymize things. I'm just saying I wouldn't be surprised if that's not the low-hanging fruit here. Now, we have done a lot of analysis and done some designs, but it's hard to make this generally applicable where you can apply different trust metrics, where you can say, if I trust these kinds of people but not those kinds of people, then how can I route more smartly to do that? One thing that you don't want to do is just use the people you trust, because then you're back to the situation like the VPN that I talked about at the very beginning of the talk, where your traffic becomes likely to be the kind of traffic that the people who trust those kinds of relays uses. So you have to kind of blend in that with other things, and we have designs to try to do that. I'm not sure if that was the specific question, but I hope it touched on an answer. And you said there was another one?
The second one, again, it's not about onion services as well, but it's about encryption. If the routing by Hamad, if the routing relay is malicious, is he able to use his private key to decrypt the Tor communication passing through it and discover the sender and the endpoint? If yes, how to prevent such a node?
No, they cannot. So they can't. After it goes through, say, the first relay, there's an extend request that goes to the second relay, and the setting up of that key involves using the public key of the second relay, and the first relay doesn't have access to the private key of the second relay, so they are not going to be able to. They don't have access to the keys further on. It's just the key that they were involved in negotiating. They don't have any access, so it's not like they know the rest of it. And the client is the one that's choosing the route. So it's not like the next relay just can tell simulate the entire Tor network and say, oh, just go to these nodes, the nodes that are my colleagues. They can't do that. They have to, the client will pick the route because it knows about the network. So a bad initial relay is only able to deny service or something. They're not able to learn about the rest of the connection. If we had lots of time, I would talk about more complicated things like website fingerprinting and things that they kind of can do, but I think that the right short answer, which is probably the only one I should have given, is that that they can't learn the rest of the circuit information for the reasons I said. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to jump ahead to the last part of the presentation. This is more recent work, and it's not about Tor and onion services per se. It does use some of these things, and the things I will talk about work on Tor, but they also work not just on Tor. So this is, in some sense, trying to get the protections that I've been talking about out to the broader web. Ideally, I think everybody should be using Tor, but realistically, I would like to protect as many people as possible until that happens. So let's dive in. So what is the web? Well, abstractly, to a first approximation, the web is just a directed graph. So you have nodes comprised of URLs, web addresses, and arcs, hyperlinks between them. And that's the graph. And there's lots of security that's been put on the web. We've got, TLS, and we've got things to protect you against phishing, and we've got DNSSEC, and we've got certificate transparency. And that's all good stuff, and it's important. But it's all U-bolted onto the web itself. So the web doesn't have any security built into it. So the URLs and the links, they don't have anything inherently secure about them. And a goal of this work is to kind of cyber retrofit built-in security for the existing less secure web. And we do this via something we call self-authenticating traditional addresses, or SATAs, and they have some nice properties. So one is this web embedded security I was just alluding to. Another is authority independent. So if you set one of these things up, then a rogue certificate authority could issue a certificate for your website, but it's not actually going to work. So they can't usurp control. It's also all backwards compatible. So if you have a browser that doesn't know anything about all this, it's still going to work. And lastly, it has this nice property that I call dirt simple trust, which is that if you learn about just an address from somebody you trust, and your software is all properly set up and everything, which is the big if, then that's all you need. The address itself will guarantee that you're going to where you think you want to go. Now, something I won't really go into other than to mention on this slide is that as a sort of bonus for free that we get, we have Tls Certificate Revocation. Now, that's a big deal because people need to rotate certificates, or they lose keys, or they have compromises. And there's been a lot of research and a lot of engineering going in to set up certificate revocation on the internet. And what SATAs allow you to do is effectively revoke certificates with one, way less overhead than CRLs or OCSP or variants of that, like OCSP stapling, if you know what that means. If you don't worry about it. It doesn't have the privacy issues that OCSP does, and it also has, again, greater autonomy for site owners because there's no interaction necessary with certificate authorities to do the revocation. You can just do it yourself locally. So let me start out again with another motivating example. So here's Alice, and she likes to go to some news and social media sites, but let's assume that she lives somewhere where the authorities don't like that so much, so they have hijacked the connections to all these sites and set up and either just block them or maybe set up fake versions of these to give out not the information that's at the legitimate sites, but whatever it is they would like instead. Now, it doesn't have to be just malicious authorities. It could just be criminals that want to, hijack her connections to legitimate sites so that they can steal her account or her money. So as we know, you can protect connections to legitimate sites via TLS authentication, and then you can know you're properly connected to them. But as we also know from what we talked about just a little while ago, these things can be hijacked. And in fact, it's not just a malicious authority that might be doing the hijacking. It's enough to be able to do a DNS hijack, which to be able to then do a TLS hijack, which means then you can get a fake certificate for things. And this is just a news article talking about how this happened at a massive scale a year ago last January. It was bad enough that the director of CISA, which is the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. There'll be a quiz later. Anyway, that they issued an emergency directive telling all the US government agencies that they had to do something to try to mitigate this tampering. Now, we have a solution. It wasn't immediately deployable, that agencies could just go and do it right away. But I think in a way, in the long run, it's more robust and better. And it's to just embed the public key into an ordinary domain name. Now, this is a mock-up. This isn't a real address, the one that's got the subdomain of CNN. I should say most of the work I'm talking about in this section was published in a paper that appeared in SecDev about a year ago, and you can go find that if you're interested. So the idea is you have this public key so that this is self-authenticating, just like onion addresses that we talked about earlier. So it's not subject to certificate hijack, and it gives the site owner control over the authentication. So the domain can't be usurped by certificate authorities. But unlike onion addresses, it's also completely backwards compatible. So these are traditional domain names that can be looked up using ordinary DNS because it's just a subdomain of CNN. You can get a certificate for these. In fact, you can get a DV certificate if you know what that means. The most important thing maybe you should take away from that is that you can get one for free and automatically via Let's Encrypt. So it just works very simply. Also, if you're a site owner, if you have an onion address, you need to, even if you have your site on the same server, well, you need to have all these pointers to the onion address versions of things, and then separately to the ordinary domain name versions of the URLs. And now you don't have to do that. You can just set up a single one and it will work either way. So it works in an ordinary browser. If the browser doesn't know anything about SAT addresses, well, you get the protections of the less secure web, TLS and things like that. And if you're going over Tor browser, well, you will get all the protections of Tor. And if you're going over a browser with the protections that the web extension we built has in it, then you will get the self-authentication pieces, although not the routing over Tor. So one of the things we've done recently is to make this more usable. So if instead of making the onion address a subdomain of the registered domain, we put it in a query string, we get all the same protections. But if you look at the bottom of the screen here, I have a quote from a paper that was published in CHI this year where they said they were looking at identity confusion about URLs on the internet. And they said when examining confusing URLs, they found that users were least able to understand URLs with long subdomains, or that stands for fully qualified domain names. You can just think of it as, DNS names. So the point is, if you have a long domain name, that's confusing. But if it's a query string, well, people are used to seeing sort of random stuff in there, but they can still recognize that the domain name is essentially for CNN. So we get the same protections, but more usably. I'm going to very quickly take you through roughly how this works. So this is an actual functional SAT address. If you were to go to that, it would work unless, it will work. It should work. And I was just wondering if Matt had taken it down or something. But anyway, so you connect to the address and they return a TLS cert as usual, and then you do a TLS handshake. That much is the same as connecting to any web server. And then once you are connected, you get sent what we call a SATA header, a header for this domain, and it's signed by the private key that corresponds to the onion address that's part of the domain name. And then inside it, it has various pieces of things that glue this all together. I'm not going to go over that right now, but this allows then a web extension that runs on Alice's computer to check to make sure that they have the proper the things in the SAT header. Now it's not just checking this header, it's also checking the TLS certificate. The thing I've circled there is the SAT address is actually in the TLS certificate. That's permitted because it's an ordinary registered domain name. It's a subdomain of that. So basically the TLS certificate is pointing at the SAT address, and the SAT key is pointing at the TLS certificate, and it's all sort of cross-verifying each other in ways that I'm not going to go into the details of. And then if something does go wrong, we have a web extension, and as I said, and that pops up an error message depending on what the error is. And in this particular example, it was expecting a particular TLS certificate, but it got a different thing, and so it gave you an error. So now let's return to our example where Alice is trying to get to CNN and Facebook and such, because when she tries to get to CNN, she's going to a SAT address for CNN. She can't be tricked to accept a hijacked certificate for these SAT sites. Now, that's because the public key is embedded. But something that could happen, if you look at the onion addresses on this slide, I've actually changed the bottom one a little bit. After the first few characters, it's actually different than this one. And so a malicious certificate authority could actually issue a malicious certificate for CNN, but now with a subdomain for an onion key for which they do own the private key because they picked it. And that could she could still be tricked. So if she has the right SAT address, then she's okay, but they could still trick her with a doppelganger effectively. And that's where dirt simple trust comes in. So if she receives the correct address from somebody she trusts, then she can be sure that she can't be hijacked. So for example, if she knows somebody that she has set up a secure signal channel with this person, if they send her a URL and they're saying, look, I know the domain owner here and this is their domain, trust me, then she can't be hijacked by anybody, because if she follows this address, she can't be sent to the wrong one. And this could be sent in a signal message, it could be written on a business card, it could be sent in a PGP signed message, so you could learn about it by any variety of ways. So now if she trusts Tom and he sends her a signal message that gives her the correct SAT address for CNN, now she's no longer able to be hijacked. So that's great. One problem is that Tom probably doesn't scale so well. So he can't be sending signal messages to everybody, and he's probably also not trusted by everybody. So how could this scale up? Well, we have a notion that we call satistation, and we've recently created what we call satistation headers that the server is able to obtain from a trusted satestor, such as Tom is one example, that then can be forwarded to the client. Now, it could be at a small thing like Tom, but it could be a large thing like a government. So looking back at the example we noted earlier, if, say, the Department of Homeland Security or the General Services Administration of the United States government, all my examples are US examples because that's where I live, but if you can bootstrap by knowing about the SAT address of this one entity, and then they provide statisticians for the entire .gov and the .mil domains, then any bogus certificates given by anybody else will not be trusted if somebody is checking the SAT address. So in addition to just making this generally available, you could imagine, for example, mandating its use for all browsers that are used by government employees and contractors when they are logging into government systems. And besides, meaning their connections won't be hijacked, if they're, say, working at home because they have to, because, hey, COVID, then we don't have to worry about them accidentally being sent to the wrong site and then trying to do their work from home and resulting in data or credential theft or something like that. So those are a couple of examples. Other things that might provide SATA stations, you could imagine the Freedom of the Press Foundation or the Berkman Center or one of these media reliability organizations could provide SATA station for all news and media sites. And our SATA stations have labels so that you can, you're not just issuing an arbitrary SATA station. Why would you trust, say, the Freedom of the Press Foundation for, US government sites? So we have the ability to restrict those down. Could also be a corporation for particular sites it owns. So if you can get to, bootstrap by knowing about Microsoft's SAT address, then they own lots of different domains. They own, live.com and office.com and MSN. And the point is they can provide a SATA station for all of that separate from certificate authorities. And this thing about government agencies, I guess I already covered. So effectively what we're providing is what I would consider a contextually relevant trust. So TLS certification is structural. Any CA anywhere can essentially issue a certificate for anybody, and that doesn't really scale down well. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the Pgp Web of Trust, and that's where individuals are signing each other's keys, and that's local. It has a structural element as well, but mostly the point is that that doesn't scale up well. And one of the nice things about this mechanism is that it covers the entire range. So it can scale up to the range of an entire government or down to an individual, and the same mechanism will work for both of these. And it could just be even structural. You could imagine that CAs could offer to do this sort of checking when they set things up, and then users and organizations could decide to trust particular CAs for SATA station while still trusting all the other CAs just to do ordinary TLS certification. So again, it's all backwards compatible. It's just how much security you're getting. If you go to things that don't have any of this built in, well, you don't have those protections, but nothing will break. And if you go to one of these sites from a browser that doesn't understand them, nothing will break either, but you can get these additional protections if you're prepared to do it. So SAT addresses, they counter certificate hijack. The client and server code, this is actually our older code. There will be new stuff soon, but it's available at this URL. I'd be happy if people want to run a SATA site themselves. SATA's enable dirt simple trust. All you have to know is the SAT address, and you can be effectively guaranteed of going to CNN or Google or wherever you're trying to get to. They're compatible with any browser. They don't just work with Tor. Right now, the extension we wrote works in Tor and Firefox, but you could write this into anything. It's scalable both up and down and provides a contextual basis for trust. It weaves security directly into the actual fabric of the web. And it, lastly, as I mentioned before, it does certificate revocation cheaper and more securely than existing mechanisms. So I think I have about technically 2 minutes left to handle any questions. I've covered a lot of ground here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions on any of this. And I hope, I guess I'll say, I hope now you understand why I said what I did at the beginning, but yes, please.
So first of all, thank you very much for this talk. It's a bit harder to simulate over these days.
Yes, right. So thank you for that. It was still appreciated.
So the first question is by Michael. You convinced... Now? I'm terribly sorry, the ping, and there is a delay. He's using Tor to download the clapping sound.
I see.
So Michael says that you convinced him that Tor is more secure than Surface Web. Tor seems to have 2 to 3 million users per day based on the metric site. Would Tor be able to handle everyone using it for all their web usage to get the extra security?
So I haven't directly worked on this, but this is something people have been working on. And there is some research, I'm not going to be able to point to it properly, but I can't even actually remember if it's been published or if it's still in the works. But there is research to investigate what happens if you scale up to 10 times as much, and how much could the existing network handle. And I mean, one thing is, of course, the network is likely to grow as more people become interested, but I don't know that. I think if you dumped the entire internet onto Tor right now, no, that would break. But it can. It does seem that it can scale pretty well, and people are working on this. And there's coordination work going on between Tor and Firefox. I don't know what state this is at, but I know that the Firefox people are looking at sort of turning on the ability to access Tor automatically, but just for certain fractions of their user base, so that they can sort of tune rolling it out. But that's a good question, and it's being explored, and I believe in the long run, yes, but maybe not just tomorrow.
Okay, so this brings the second question on this line, which is, what is the future of Tor? I mean, not just capacity-wise, but what do you think will happen in the next 5, 10, possibly 20 years with Tor?
Well, whatever I think is almost certainly wrong. Let's start with that. But I mean, I think I've got it here on this slide, if assuming that's still shared. I think that well, one, there's always this progression where something gets set up kind of just innocently with no security, and then people realize that they need it, and so I think that people are certainly more aware than they were of the needs to have the kinds of protections it provides. People are more aware now than they were 5 years ago, and I assume that it's going to, interest is going to grow, and I think particularly I've already described the extent to which I think the distinction between onion addresses and the broader web are not so black and white as people like to paint it. That it's actually much more of a gradation and a combination of properties. And with SATAs, I believe that's even more the case, because then you have something that if you're coming via Tor, you get Tor's protections, and if you're coming via a different browser, if it has the web extension, then you have the self-authentication protections, but not the routing and lookup extra protections. And then if you're coming via a browser that doesn't know anything about it, well, you don't get any of that, but nothing breaks. So I think that as these things get more developed, I think I think it's only going to grow, and I think that's a good thing.
So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Let's try again. Synchronized hand clapping is a new Olympic sport over Zoom. The Olympics 2021.
with an international team. So.
Yep. And after that, this concludes the first day of the summer school. Tomorrow,
for those of you for whom it's not still morning.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry about that. We're trying to...
No.
It's okay. It's okay. Actually, there was a discussion earlier in the morning internally whether we should start using Jesus time zone and that sort of stuff. So people will have only one single time zone. It works in China, in Beijing. So with Beijing time zone, China is quite large.
Yeah, well, works is probably a relative term too, right? So.
Yep, but as mentioned before, China is slightly different in other countries.
Right. So, okay. Well, thank you, I guess, and I guess I should stop sharing my screen here. So,
the rest of you, we'll be very happy to see you tomorrow on the day that starts 10 a.m. Israeli time on contact tracing, and we're going to have several people covering the topic from different topics. So see you all tomorrow Israel time, or later on today if you happen to be in different time zones.
Bye-bye.